So our second snippet of this week. Remember, we ended the first snippet with the aftermath of the war with Mexico. Um, and this unsettled situation in the territories that were seized from Mexico. The best case scenario for the United States would have been for this territory to have remained underpopulated for years and just to try to postpone the problem as long as possible. That can't happen because of the events in this photograph. This is the California gold rush, which leads to this explosion of population in California and leads California to petition the Union for admission as a free state. There were relatively few slaves in California in 1850. This then is thrown into the lap of Congress. Congress doesn't really know what to do about it. And the Whig senator from Kentucky, remember we saw him with the compromise over Missouri as a young member of the House from Kentucky, Speaker of the House. At this point, he is now a senior leader of the Senate from Kentucky, Henry Clay. And in his last major legislative initiative, Clay pushes through the Compromise of 1850, which allows California to be admitted as a free state. So basically, the Compromise of 1850 sets aside the Missouri Compromise, because the Missouri Compromise said that anything south of my arrow here that I'm going across the screen would have to be slave state. Clay says, we're not going to do that. We're going to admit California as a free state, which gives free states more members of the Senate. But we will give the South all kinds of sort of benefits. Slavery will remain legal in the District of Columbia, which is very important for Southerners symbolically. They wanted to show that the capital of the country allowed human beings to be enslaved. Texas, this newly admitted slave state, gets a $10 million payment from the federal government in agreement for ceding some of this territory that will go into the New Mexico territory and to the Kansas territory. The fugitive slave law was strengthened. So the fugitive slave law was a national law. When slaves would escape the South, often to the Underground Railroad, they would go to the northern states. Technically, again, they're listed as property at this point in the United States. But many northern states would basically say, we're not going to enforce the law. We're not going to send slaves back into slavery. The fugitive slave law was a national law basically designed to preempt local opposition. So it's a major victory for the slave interest. And then Utah and New Mexico are organized according to a principle called popular sovereignty. Remember, we were talking a lot about this issue of sovereignty in the Constitutional Convention on Monday. This is a somewhat different form of sovereignty. Basically, it says when these entities will become states, the residents of these areas will get to vote on whether slavery is or is not legal. In real terms, no one ever thought slavery was going to come to Utah or to Nevada. But basically, this was a face-saving way for Southerners to say, all right, we're going to, we don't want slavery outlawed on this territory, so everyone knows we're not going to have slavery. But critically, this introduction of the theme of popular sovereignty will become a major issue 4 years later in the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So Clay's hope is Missouri Compromise lasted for 30 years. Compromise of 1850, if that lasts for 30 years, then we'll be to 1880, and who knows what will happen. Instead, the Compromise of 1850 lasts a grand total of 4 years. And the reason for this is that as slavery becomes the central issue in American politics, the Whig Party, which was a bisectional party, Northern and Southern support, begins to wither away and die. In the 1852 election, the Whigs carry only 4 states. The states that are in purple on this map. A Democratic, pro-slavery, expansionist type named Franklin Pierce is elected president. And Pierce is a quite weak president. The power behind the throne, at least initially during the Pierce presidency, is this man, Stephen Douglas. And Douglas is an Illinois senator. Among other things, he is a strong supporter of a railroad that would run from Chicago to the Pacific coast, which he thinks is going to benefit Chicago economically, which it would have and which it ultimately will. But the critical thing is that the railroad is not viable economically as long as this territory, which is dominated by Indian nations, remains unorganized. So this is his chief legislative goal. He wants to create formal territories here, which will allow for a greater degree of law and order and give the railroads enough impetus to build the railroad across the continent. And Douglas goes to Northerners, and there's some like this, some don't. He goes to Southerners, and Southerners basically say we're not going to support any territories in this region unless there's a possibility that the successor states could become slave states. And as a result, Douglas proposes the idea, he carries forth the Clay principle of popular sovereignty to the Nebraska and Kansas territories. This becomes known as the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And this, there's no pretense here that the Missouri Compromise line ever remains in effect. This is Kansas-Nebraska Act is one of the single most polarizing pieces of legislation in American history. In the North, there is a sense that Douglas has sold out the region on behalf of the South. In the South, there's some resistance that they're saying pro-slavery positions become more radical, and they're kind of saying, we should have slavery everywhere here. There shouldn't be popular sovereignty. And the result is in the 1854 elections to the House, the midterm elections. This is an election unlike any other in American history in that it produces a genuinely four-party race. The Democrats get crushed. They lose 73 seats. They remain the largest party in the House, but only because the Whig Party also loses seats. And then we get these two new parties that are created, the American Party and the Republican Party. American Party is better known as the Know Nothings. This is an anti-immigrant nativist party, but a party that has a degree of support in both the North and the South. And the Republican Party is a pro-business, anti-slavery, reformist party that's founded only in 1854 and largely supplants the Whig Party in more liberal northern states. So one of the questions is, can a constitutional system, which really is designed as a two-party system, function as a four-party system? The answer to that question is no. This period, 1855 to 1856, is the most politically unstable period, I think, in American history. It takes the House of Representatives 133 ballots to elect a Speaker of the House, a compromise candidate, Nathaniel Banks, a Republican from Massachusetts. That's nothing compared to what happens in 1856, the caning of Charles Sumner. This is a drawing of what had happened. A member of the House, Preston Brooks, who was infuriated by an anti-slavery speech delivered by Sumner, in which Sumner had attacked Brooks's father-in-law, a U.S. Senator from South Carolina, in very personal terms. Brooks goes from the House chamber to the Senate chamber, takes a cane, as you can see here on the map, and bangs Sumner over the head. Sumner will be out of the Senate, recovering from his injuries for more than 2 years as a result of this. So the American constitutional system is really breaking down during the Pierce administration, and Pierce is seen as a failed president. He's shunted aside by the Democrats. And instead, they go to James Buchanan. And Buchanan's chief advantage was he was from Pennsylvania, so he's not a Southerner, but his chief advantage was he'd been out of the country for the previous 4 years as the U.S. minister to Great Britain. So the sense is he's kind of a senior statesman. He was the former Secretary of State. The South basically liked him, but Pennsylvania was a swing state. He was clearly experienced. He wins relatively narrowly, and he sacrifices any moral authority that he has by scheming behind the scenes with Roger Taney, the the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And Buchanan and Tawney are discussing this case that's before the Supreme Court, the Dred Scott case. We all know the story of Dred Scott, who was a slave, whose owner takes him to a free state from Missouri, whose owner takes him to a free state, Illinois, and then a free territory, Minnesota, and then the owner tries to take him back to Missouri. He sues, and the argument that he makes, which is clearly the correct argument, is, look, you know, I've been in free states, and therefore the art of taking me to a free state has led me to be free. This issue is argued before the court before Buchanan takes office, but Tawney gives Buchanan a heads off that they're likely to decide against Dred Scott. And so Buchanan's inauguration speech says, I don't know what's going to happen with this measure, but we should just trust whatever the Supreme Court does and accept their judgment. This decision is generally considered to be the single worst decision in the history of the Supreme Court. Its only rivals are Plessy versus Ferguson, which legitimizes Jim Crow in the 1890s, and Korematsu versus the United States, which legitimizes the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. And the argument that Tawney makes is that the entire suit is invalid because Dred Scott is not a person. He is not a citizen. He is a piece of property. And as such, according to the decision, the federal government does not have the authority to forbid the slavery anywhere in the country, in federal territories or in the southern slave states. It's a maximal decision. It engenders extraordinary opposition. The Republican Party is energized in the midterm elections of 1858. The most famous episode from this midterm, one that probably we all know, the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And Lincoln, kicking off his Senate campaign, he ultimately loses the election with his House divided speech. And the argument that Lincoln makes is an argument in favor of the Union. He suggests that it's unlikely that the Union will be able to remain together, half slave and half free. So in some ways, this is a rejection of the compromises that were made at the Constitutional Convention. Although it's critical here what Lincoln does not say in the House divided speech. He does not argue for the abolition of slavery across the board. He basically just says that what we need is a system in which the expansion of slavery must be prevented. And in the 1858 midterms, the Republicans become the largest party in the House for the first time, a party that had only been founded 4 years before, and they gain a significant number of seats in the Senate as well. So slavery is creating this system in which the Constitution is increasingly becoming undone. And in our third snippet, we will look at the effects of this during the Civil War.